The divorce papers felt like ice against Isabella's fingertips, a stark contrast to the gentle warmth of the life growing inside her. Just hours ago, she had been planning a nursery. Now she was being discarded. Ethan, her husband of 5 years, the man who had vowed to cherish her, stood by the marble fireplace, his expression unreadable. Chloe offers me a future, Izzy, a life without complications. The word complications hung in the air, a cruel euphemism for their unborn child. He was choosing his mistress, leaving Isabella pregnant and alone. Little did he know, the woman he was abandoning was no damsel in distress. She was the sole heiress to the Valeriano casino dynasty, and the storm she was about to unleash would bring his gilded world crashing down. The scent of rain-soaked asphalt and old money clung to the air in their corner of Pacific Heights. From the bay window of their 3-story Victorian, Isabella watched the fog roll in, a familiar gray shroud that seemed to mirror the creeping chill in her own life. Their home, a masterpiece of restored architecture that Ethan had proudly pointed out in an issue of Architectural Digest, felt less like a sanctuary and more like a beautifully appointed museum of a life she was no longer sure was hers. Ethan found her there, his reflection appearing in the glass before she heard his footsteps on the polished oak. He was a man carved from ambition, his jawline sharp, his smile a carefully calibrated tool he wielded with practiced ease. He'd built a boutique investment firm from the ground up, a testament to his relentless drive. When they met, she had been captivated by that fire, by the way he looked at her as if she were the final, most precious acquisition in his collection. "Still staring at the fog, Izzy?" he asked, his voice smooth as the aged whiskey he favored. He placed a hand on her shoulder, but the touch felt distant, a gesture performed out of habit rather than affection. Isabella forced a smile, turning from the window. "Just thinking. The doctor's appointment went well today." She placed a hand over the slight, still subtle swell of her stomach. The heartbeat was so strong, Ethan, like a tiny hummingbird. A flicker of something, was it panic, crossed his face before it was replaced by his usual charming mask. "That's great. Really great." He moved away, loosening his tie as he walked toward the bar cart, a gleaming Art Deco piece he'd won at a charity auction. "Listen, about tonight, something's come up with the Mercer account. I'm going to have to work late." The excuse was so worn, so thin, it was almost transparent. It had been the Mercer account last week, and a conference call with Hong Kong the week before. His nights grew longer, his excuses more elaborate, while the space between them and their king-sized bed yawned like a chasm. She had tried to ignore it, attributing his distance to the pressures of his work, the stress of impending fatherhood. She had decorated the nursery in shades of soft sage and cream, bought a ridiculously expensive cashmere baby blanket, and read books on gentle parenting, all in a desperate attempt to build a bridge back to him. "Oh," she said, her voice small. "Okay, I was going to make that pasta you like, the one with the truffle cream sauce. Save me some," he said, not looking at her as he poured himself a drink. The clink of ice against crystal was the only sound in the room for a long moment. Isabella watched him, a knot of dread tightening in her chest. She remembered the early days, the whirlwind romance. He had pursued her with a single-minded intensity that had been both flattering and overwhelming. He loved her quiet nature, her background as a freelance art restorer, a skill she'd learned from her grandfather. He called her his old soul, his calm in the storm. He hadn't asked much about her family, and she hadn't offered. "They're private people," she'd said, a half-truth that seemed to satisfy him. Her past was a locked room, and he, a man obsessed with the future, had never bothered to ask for the key. He saw her simply as Isabella Rossi, a woman with impeccable taste and a gentle spirit, the perfect wife to complete the portrait of his success. The truth was far more complex. The name she carried was a shield, a deliberate separation from the one she'd been born with, Valeriano. The Valeriano name was synonymous with the neon glow of Las Vegas, the clatter of poker chips, and the kind of wealth that was both dazzling and dangerous. Her grandfather, Niccolo Valeriano, had built an empire from a single blackjack table, a sprawling dynasty of casinos and hotels known as the Seraphim Group. Isabella had fled that world at 18, craving anonymity, a life built on her own terms, not on a legacy of high-stakes gambling and backroom deals. She had met Ethan a few years later, and in him, she thought she'd found her escape, her normal. Now, that illusion was shattering. "Ethan," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "We need to talk. Something's wrong. I can feel it." He downed his whiskey in one swallow, the movement sharp and decisive. He set the glass down with a heavy thud and finally met her eyes. The warmth was gone. In its place was a cold, hard resolve that terrified her. "You're right," he said. "We do need to talk." He didn't sit. He stood by the fireplace, one hand resting on the marble mantelpiece, positioning himself as if he were addressing a boardroom, not his pregnant wife. "I'm not happy, Isabella. I haven't been for a long time." Each word was a carefully placed stone, building a wall between them. "What are you talking about? We're having a baby. We're supposed to be a family." "That's just it," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "This baby, it changes everything. The timing is all wrong. My business is at a critical stage. I need to be focused, agile. A child. It's a complication I can't afford right now." The word hit her like a physical blow. Complication. Their child, the tiny life she was nurturing, was a line item on his balance sheet, a liability. "How can you say that?" she whispered, tears blurring his cruel, handsome face. "Because it's the truth," he said, his gaze unwavering. "And there's something else. Someone else." He said the name without hesitation, as if it had been resting on his tongue for weeks. "Chloe." Chloe? The name was vaguely familiar. A junior associate at his firm? No, a client's daughter. A socialite she'd seen photographed at charity galas, always draped in diamonds and a predatory smile. "She understands my world, Izzy. She's part of it. The ambition, the drive. We're aligned." He took a deep breath, the final, fatal plunge. "I'm leaving you. My lawyer will be in touch tomorrow with the papers." The room tilted. The beautiful objects, the curated art, the sweeping view of the bay, it all swam in a nauseating blur. She clutched her stomach, a primal, protective instinct. "I'm pregnant, Ethan. With your child. I'll provide for you, of course," he said, the offer as insulting as the betrayal itself. "You and the complication will be well taken care of. A generous settlement. You won't have to worry about anything." He thought it was about money. He was trying to buy his freedom, to settle his conscience with a wire transfer. The arrogance of it was breathtaking. He had no idea who he was talking to, what power she could wield if she chose to. But in that moment, she wasn't an heiress. She was just a woman whose heart was being systematically dismantled by the man she loved. "Get out," she choked out, the words raw and broken. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his features. He had expected tears, pleading, perhaps even hysterics. He had not expected this quiet, cold fury. "Izzy, get out of my house." He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded curtly. He turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing on the oak floors, each one a final, definitive goodbye. Isabella stood frozen, listening until the sound of the heavy front door closing sealed the silence. The gilded cage had broken open, and she was in a freefall. The silence Ethan left behind was a living entity. It filled the cavernous rooms of the Victorian, seeped into the expensive upholstery, and mocked her from every polished surface. For the first 24 hours, Isabella did not move from the living room. She sat on the cream-colored sofa, a relic from a life that now felt like a fiction, and watched the city lights blink on through the bay window as night fell. The divorce papers had arrived that morning, delivered by a cold-faced courier, their clinical language a brutal counterpoint to the storm of grief raging inside her. Irreconcilable differences. The phrase was a lie. Their differences had been reconciled, smoothed over, and hidden beneath a veneer of domestic bliss for years. The real reason was sitting in a folder on the coffee table, a prenuptial agreement, drafted by Ethan's formidable legal team 5 years ago. She had signed it without a second thought, blinded by love and a naive belief in forever. It was ironclad, designed to protect his burgeoning empire. It stipulated a one-time payout, a generous sum that, to him, was a rounding error, but to the world would seem like a fortune. It was hush money, go-away money. It was an insult wrapped in six figures. Her phone buzzed incessantly. Her friends, Ethan's friends really, were sending texts. Concerned at first. "Is everything okay? Haven't heard from you." Then as the news, undoubtedly leaked by Ethan's camp, began to circulate, the tone shifted. Pitying. Awkward. "Thinking of you. So sorry to hear what happened." They were choosing sides, and she was on the losing one. On the second day, a wave of nausea, sharper and more insistent than the usual morning sickness, forced her to her feet. As she retched into the cold porcelain of a guest bathroom toilet, a fierce, protective anger began to burn through the fog of her sorrow. It wasn't just her he had abandoned, it was their child, her baby, and she would not let them be a casualty of his ambition. She walked through the house, her house, and saw it for what it was, a stage set for his life. Every painting, every sculpture, every book on the shelves had been chosen to project an image of cultured success. Her own contributions, the subtle touches of warmth and personality, seemed to have been swallowed whole. In the nursery, the serene sage-green walls felt like a mockery. She ran her hand over the empty crib, her heart aching with a pain so profound it stole her breath. This was a dream he had allowed her to build. Knowing all along he was going to tear it down, that was when she made the call. She scrolled through her contacts past the numbers of florists, caterers, and the society wives she lunched with, until she found a name she hadn't dialed in 5 years. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar, gravelly voice answered. "Isabella?" The voice was laced with surprise and a guarded warmth. There was no preamble, no small talk. With him, there never was. "Grandfather," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I need to come home." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a silence heavy with unspoken questions and years of distance. She had left his world, rejected the Valeriano legacy, and he had let her go. Niccolo Valeriano was not a man who pleaded. He ruled his empire from a penthouse suite atop the Seraphim Grand in Las Vegas, a kingdom of glass and light. He was a patriarch from another era, a man of immense power, fierce loyalty, and unforgiving principles. She had broken his heart when she left, and in turn, she had broken her own. "The jet will be at the Oakland private airfield in 3 hours, he said, his tone decisive, leaving no room for argument. "A car will be at your door in 30 minutes. Pack what you need." "Grandfather, she started, unsure of what to say. "I'm sorry, I was wrong. I'm pregnant. I'm lost." "We will talk when you are here, mia cara," he said gently, the Italian endearment a balm on her raw nerves. "Just come home." The line went dead. Isabella felt a tremor of fear mixed with an overwhelming sense of relief. She was running from one gilded cage straight into another, but this one at least was her own. The car, a discreet black town car with tinted windows, arrived precisely 30 minutes later. The driver, a man built like a mountain with a kind face named Leo, had worked for her grandfather for as long as she could remember. He took her single suitcase without a word, his presence a silent promise of safety. As she walked out of the Victorian for the last time, she left the key on the hall table, next to the folder containing the divorce papers. She didn't take a final look back. The house, the life, the man. They were already part of a past she had to survive. The flight to Las Vegas was a surreal transition. The gray, foggy skies of San Francisco gave way to the harsh, clear sunlight of the Mojave Desert. As the plane descended, the city appeared like a mirage, a sprawling oasis of impossible architecture and shimmering light. This was the world she had run from, a world of calculated risk and high reward, of dazzling facades and hidden depths. The Seraphim Grand towered over the Strip, its curved glass exterior reflecting the desert sky. Her grandfather's penthouse was the entire top floor, a private kingdom with 360-degree views of the city he had built. When the private elevator doors opened, he was there, waiting. Niccolo Valeriano was 80 years old, but he carried himself with the unyielding authority of a man half his age. His silver hair was impeccably groomed, his dark eyes sharp and intelligent, missing nothing. He was dressed in a tailored suit, a stark contrast to the casual wealth of Ethan's world. This was old power, a different species of influence altogether. He opened his arms and Isabella fell into them, the sobs she had been holding back for days finally breaking free. He held her, his hand gently stroking her hair, letting her cry until the storm passed. He smelled of cigars and bay rum, the scent of her childhood. "He is a fool, Isabella," Niccolo said, his voice a low rumble. "A blind, arrogant fool." He led her to a plush sofa overlooking the glittering expanse of the city. He had already been briefed. Her grandfather had eyes and ears everywhere. He knew of Ethan's betrayal, of the pregnancy, of the insulting settlement. "He does not know who you are," Niccolo stated, pouring her a glass of water with a steady hand. "No," Isabella admitted, her voice hoarse. "I wanted a normal life. I didn't want the name, all of this." She gestured vaguely at the opulent room, at the city below. "There is no such thing as a normal life," her grandfather said, his expression grim. "There is only the life you are given and the one you have the strength to claim. You are a Valeriano. You have the blood of kings and gamblers in your veins. You have forgotten this. It is time for you to remember." He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "This boy, this Ethan, he has tried to discard you. He thinks he can throw away my granddaughter, my blood, and the mother of my great-grandchild like she is nothing." A dangerous light glinted in his eyes. He is about to learn that when you bet against the house of Valeriano, the house always wins. His words sent a shiver down her spine. It was not just a promise of support, it was a declaration of war. And for the first time since the world had fallen out from under her, Isabella felt a flicker of something other than pain. It was a cold, hard spark of Valeriano fire. Ethan felt a profound sense of liberation. Driving his Aston Martin down the Pacific Coast Highway, the top down and the salty air whipping through his hair, he felt like a man unshackled. Chloe sat beside him, her laughter as bright and carefree as the California sun. She was everything Isabella wasn't: effervescent, spontaneous, and unapologetically ambitious. Her father, a titan of the tech industry, was exactly the kind of connection Ethan needed to elevate his firm from successful to legendary. Their affair had started 6 months ago, a slow burn of flirtatious glances over business dinners and lingering touches that escalated into clandestine meetings in boutique hotels. Chloe was a thrill, a conquest. She saw the world as he did, a series of strategic moves, of calculated risks for maximum reward. She didn't talk about nurseries or feelings. She talked about IPOs and market disruption. She was a partner, not a dependent. "Happy, darling?" she purred, leaning over to kiss his cheek. Her perfume, expensive and intoxicating, filled the car. "Happier than I've been in a long time," he answered, and he believed it. The guilt over Isabella was a dull ache, easily ignored. He'd done the honorable thing, he told himself. He hadn't dragged it out. He'd been clean, decisive. The settlement was more than fair. It would set her up for life. She was a simple woman with simple needs. She would cry for a while. Then she would take the money and build a quiet, unassuming life for herself and the child. He winced internally at the thought. The pregnancy had been the catalyst, the final terrifying proof that the life he was building with Isabella was a cage, one of soft cushions and domestic obligations, but a cage nonetheless. He was destined for more than PTA meetings and suburban barbecues. They spent the weekend at a lavish resort in Big Sur, a place where privacy was the ultimate luxury. Their bungalow overlooked the ocean, and they made love with a desperate, frantic energy, as if to physically erase the memory of the life he'd just left behind. He showered Chloe with gifts, a diamond tennis bracelet, a vintage bottle of champagne, tokens of his newfound freedom. "My father's so excited to have you officially in the family," Chloe said one evening as they dined on the terrace, the sunset painting the sky in fiery hues. "He's been talking about the potential for a strategic partnership between his venture capital fund and your firm. This was it, the jackpot. An alliance with Chloe's father would give him access to a level of capital and influence he had only dreamed of. All his years of grinding, of ruthless networking and 80-hour work weeks were about to pay off. The sacrifice of his marriage felt not just necessary, but prudent, a sound business decision. When he returned to the city on Monday morning, he felt like a king. He walked into his office, a sleek modern space of glass and steel overlooking the financial district, ready to conquer the world. His assistant, a sharp young woman named Maya, handed him his messages with her usual efficiency. "Your lawyer called, Mr. Hayes. He said, Mrs. Hayes, Isabella, has not responded to the settlement offer. The papers were left at the house. Ethan frowned. Fine. She's probably just being emotional. Give her a few days. She'll come around. He dismissed the thought, turning his attention to the markets. But as the week wore on, a strange disquiet began to settle over him. Isabella's silence was unnerving. He had expected a fight, tears, angry phone calls. He had prepared himself for a messy, emotional battle. This complete and utter absence was something else entirely. He called her phone. It went straight to voicemail. He told himself it was for the best, a clean break. The first crack in his perfect new world appeared on Thursday. He had a meeting with Marcus Thorne, a conservative, old-money investor whose backing had given Ethan's firm its initial stamp of legitimacy. Ethan, Marcus said, his tone unusually cool as they sat in his stuffy, wood-paneled office. I heard about you and Isabella. A shame. She's a lovely girl, very classy. It was a difficult decision, Marcus. But for the best, Ethan said, trying to steer the conversation back to business. Is it true what they're saying? That she's pregnant? Marcus asked, his eyes sharp and judgmental. Ethan felt a flush of anger. That's a private matter. Not when it affects business, Marcus retorted. Reputation is everything in our world, son. A man who leaves his pregnant wife for a younger woman, it's not a good look. It suggests a certain instability, a lack of character. He steepled his fingers. Thorne Consolidated is pulling its portfolio from your firm. We'll be transferring the assets by the end of the month. Ethan was stunned. Thorne's investment was a cornerstone of his firm. Marcus, you can't be serious. My personal life has no bearing on my ability to manage your money. On the contrary, Marcus said, standing to signal the end of the meeting. It has every bearing on my trust in you as a man, and I don't do business with men I don't trust. The news of Thorne's withdrawal sent a ripple of panic through the office. It was a vote of no confidence from a major player. Other clients started calling, asking pointed questions. His carefully constructed reputation was beginning to fray at the edges. He confronted Chloe that night in her minimalist, white-on-white apartment. Did you tell people Isabella was pregnant? He demanded, his voice tight with frustration. Chloe was examining her nails, looking bored. It must have slipped out. People were asking why you left her. It's the truth, isn't it? The truth is that it's tanking my business. Marcus Thorne just pulled out. He said I had a lack of character. She finally looked at him, her expression hardening. Don't be so dramatic, Ethan. It's one old dinosaur. My father's investment will more than make up for it. You need to stop worrying about your pathetic little ex-wife and focus on the future. Our future. Her words, meant to be reassuring, felt cold and dismissive. Pathetic little ex-wife. Was that how he saw Isabella now? The thought was unsettling. He remembered her gentle kindness, the way she could calm his anxieties with a simple touch, the quiet strength he had mistaken for weakness. A few days later, a second, more powerful tremor shook his world. He received a call from his contact at a major financial blog, a journalist he occasionally fed scoops to. Ethan, buddy, I'm calling as a courtesy, the journalist said, his voice buzzing with excitement. We're running a story tomorrow. It's big. You might want to prepare a statement. What story? Ethan asked, a sense of dread coiling in his stomach. Your ex-wife, Isabella Rossi. Turns out that's not her real name, or not her full name, anyway. There was a pause for dramatic effect. Her name is Isabella Valeriano Rossi, as in Niccolo Valeriano of the Seraphim Group. She's his only grandchild, his sole heir. The phone slipped from Ethan's hand, clattering onto his expensive mahogany desk. Valeriano. The name was whispered with a mixture of fear and awe on Wall Street. The Seraphim Group was a private behemoth, an empire of casinos, real estate, and private equity with a valuation so high it was almost mythical. They were notoriously private, ruthless in business, and fiercely protective of their own. Isabella, his quiet, unassuming Izzy. The art restorer, who claimed to have a private family, was the heiress to one of the largest fortunes in the country. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just that he had been deceived. It was the sheer scale of his own ignorance. He had looked at a queen and seen only a pawn. He had abandoned her. He had called her child a complication. He had offered her a settlement that was, to her, probably the equivalent of pocket change. He hadn't just divorced his wife. He had insulted the house of Valeriano. And now they knew. The silence from her end suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. It wasn't the silence of a victim. It was the silence of a predator, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The Mojave heat was a dry, searing force, a stark contrast to the climate-controlled chill of the Seraphim Grand. For the first week, Isabella felt as if she were surfacing from a deep dive, gasping for air in a world that was both foreign and achingly familiar. She slept in her old girlhood bedroom, a suite of rooms decorated in shades of cream and gold, with a balcony that overlooked the pulsing, neon heart of Las Vegas. The city she had once seen as a prison now felt like a fortress. Her grandfather gave her space. He was a master of patience, a trait he'd honed over decades of high-stakes poker. He let her grieve, let her sleep, and ensured a steady stream of her favorite foods appeared without her having to ask. But beneath his quiet attentiveness, she could feel him watching, waiting. One evening, he found her in the vast two-story library, a room paneled in dark wood and filled with rare first editions. She was running her hand over the binding of a book on Renaissance art, a relic of the life she'd tried to build for herself. "Your mother loved this room," Niccolo said, his voice soft. He walked over to a portrait that hung above the fireplace, a beautiful, dark-haired woman with Isabella's eyes and a sad, knowing smile. Sofia Valeriano Rossi. She had died when Isabella was 12, a tragedy that had shattered their small family and solidified Niccolo's overprotective grip on his only grandchild. "She would have hated what I let happen to me," Isabella said, her voice barely a whisper. "No," Niccolo corrected gently. "She would have hated that you forgot who you were. You are her daughter. You are my heir. That is not a burden, Isabella. It is a source of strength." He gestured for her to sit, taking the armchair opposite her. "I did you a disservice when I let you run away. I thought I was giving you freedom. Instead, I let you walk into the world unarmed. I wanted to be normal," she confessed. "I didn't want to be the Valeriano heiress. I wanted someone to love me for me, not for my name. And you found a man who loved you for what he thought you were. A beautiful, docile accessory with no threatening connections," Niccolo said bluntly. "A man who saw your kindness as weakness and your independence as a liability. He did not love you, mia cara. He loved the idea of you, an object he could possess." His words were harsh, but they rang with undeniable truth. Ethan had never truly seen her. He had seen a reflection of his own ambitions. "What he has done is an act of war against this family," Niccolo continued, his voice hardening. "The disrespect is profound, but how we respond is up to you. I will burn his world to the ground if you ask it of me. But there is another way, a better way." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "Power is not about destruction, Isabella. It is about control. It is about seeing the whole board, understanding your opponent's weaknesses, and making them play your game. Your husband is a man built on image and perception. His entire empire is a house of cards built on the trust of others. We will not blow it down. We will simply remove the card that holds it all up." A new fire began to smolder within Isabella. The grief was still there, a heavy stone in her heart, but now it was accompanied by a cold, clear-eyed anger. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to learn the business," he said. "Our business. You have a brilliant mind, a gift for seeing the details others miss. I saw it in you when you were just a girl, studying the brushstrokes on a canvas. The casino floor is no different. It is a world of strategy, psychology, and calculated risk. It is time you took your seat at the table." The next day, her education began. It was not a series of boring boardroom meetings, but a master class in power, taught by the Grand Master himself. Niccolo walked her through the heart of the Seraphim Grand, not as a guest, but as its future queen. He showed her the intricate web of surveillance, the eye in the sky, where analysts monitored every table, every player, looking for cheats, high rollers, and tells. "Every person who walks through these doors is telling a story," Niccolo explained, his voice echoing in the quiet, high-tech command center. "Their posture, their bets, the sweat on their brow. The trick is to learn how to read them. Your husband, for example, he projects confidence, but he is terrified of losing control. He craves legitimacy, the approval of old money. That is his weakness." She met with the heads of the Valeriano Empire. There was Marco, the stoic head of security, who had been her father's best friend. There was Lena, the sharp, impeccably dressed CFO, who could dissect a balance sheet with surgical precision. They treated her with a deferential respect that was initially jarring. They weren't seeing Isabella Rossi, the spurned wife. They were seeing Isabella Valeriano, the future of the dynasty. Slowly, something inside her began to shift. The world of art restoration, a world of quiet contemplation and patient work, had taught her focus. Her grandfather was right. The skills were transferable. She began to see the patterns, the flow of money and power, the intricate dance of risk and reward that underpinned the entire operation. She started attending morning briefings, initially as a silent observer, then asking sharp, insightful questions that earned her nods of approval from Lena and Marco. The news of her identity broke on a Wednesday, exactly as her grandfather had predicted. It wasn't a leak. It was a carefully orchestrated press release from the Seraphim Group announcing that Ms. Isabella Valeriano Rossi, sole heir to the Valeriano fortune, was taking an active role in the family business, starting with the oversight of the group's substantial real estate and investment portfolios. The announcement was accompanied by a single stunning photograph of her, taken a few days prior. She stood on the balcony of the penthouse, the lights of Vegas glittering behind her. She was not smiling. Her expression was one of cool, formidable composure. The vulnerable wife was gone. In her place stood a queen. The story exploded. Financial blogs, gossip columns, and mainstream news outlets picked it up immediately. Millionaire mogul's ex-wife revealed as secret casino heiress. The ultimate revenge story, how Isabella Valeriano is poised to take over Las Vegas. Her phone, which had been silent for weeks, lit up with calls and texts from the very people who had abandoned her. The society wives, the fair-weather friends, all scrambling to get back in her orbit. She ignored them all. Later that day, her grandfather handed her a tablet. It was open to a live feed of the stock market. "Watch," he said. She saw the ticker for Ethan's firm, Hayes Capital. Hayes. A cascade of red numbers flowed next to it. It was plummeting. Marcus Thorne pulling out was a tremor, Niccolo explained, a grim satisfaction in his voice. "This is the earthquake. Our announcement, coupled with the news of your pregnancy and his infidelity, has painted him as a fool at best and a predator at worst. He built his reputation on being a savvy judge of value, and it turns out he couldn't recognize the single most valuable asset in his own home. No one will trust his judgment now. His investors are abandoning him in droves." Isabella watched the numbers fall, a dizzying descent into ruin. She felt a cold knot of satisfaction, but it was not triumphant. It was the somber, righteous feeling of a debt being paid. She had not sought this. She had not asked for this war, but she was a Valeriano, and she would not lose. She was no longer just a woman scorned. She was the queen of spades, and she was about to play her hand. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Ethan felt like he was standing in the epicenter of a controlled demolition, one he had unwittingly triggered. His phone didn't stop ringing, a cacophony of panicked investors, furious clients, and opportunistic journalists. The headline from the Wall Street Journal was seared into his brain: "The billion-dollar blind spot, how Ethan Hayes fumbled an empire." He was a laughingstock. The man who prided himself on his foresight, on his ability to spot a winning investment before anyone else, had been living with the heiress to the Valeriano fortune and had been completely oblivious. The narrative was brutal and universal. He was an idiot, a greedy, short-sighted fool who had traded a queen for a jack. His office, once a symbol of his ascent, became a bunker. He barked orders at his staff, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a raw, frantic paranoia. "Get our PR team on the phone. I want a statement out now. No comment on my personal life. Emphasize the firm's strong fundamentals." But there were no strong fundamentals left. The firm's value was intrinsically tied to his reputation, and his reputation was in ashes. By noon, Hayes had lost 40% of its value. Margin calls were coming in, and the liquidity he thought he had was evaporating. Chloe's reaction was a study in self-preservation. She arrived at his office not with words of comfort, but with an icy fury. "You have made me look like a fool, Ethan," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. She threw a copy of a gossip magazine onto his desk. The cover featured a picture of her and Ethan, smiling on their Big Sur getaway, Next to the regal, powerful photo of Isabella, the headline read, "The Mistress versus the Heiress." "You told me she was nobody," Chloe continued, her face contorted with rage. "A quiet little artist with no family to speak of. You didn't think to mention she was practically royalty in the business world?" "I didn't know," he yelled back, the frustration and panic boiling over. "How could I have known? She never said a word." "Oh, so this is her fault now?" Chloe laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "You were married to her for 5 years, and you couldn't be bothered to learn the first thing about her family? My father is furious. He called me this morning. The partnership is off. He said, and I quote, 'I don't invest with men who have such catastrophic lapses in judgment.' He thinks you're a liability." The final pillar of his new life crumbled. The strategic alliance with her father, the very reason he had justified his betrayal, was gone. He had blown up his life for nothing. "So that's it?" he asked, his voice hollow. "You're just leaving?" "What did you expect?" she scoffed, grabbing her designer handbag from the chair. "That I would stand by you while you sink? I'm not your sad, pathetic little Isabella. I don't do sinking ships." She paused at the door, turning to deliver the final blow. "And to think I actually thought you were smart. Turns out you were just lucky, and your luck just ran out." The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Ethan in a silence that was more damning than her yelling. He was alone, utterly and completely alone. The next few weeks were a blur of damage control and desperate maneuvers. He tried to secure a line of credit to stop the bleeding, but the banks wouldn't touch him. He tried to reassure his remaining clients, but his words sounded hollow even to himself. The story had taken on a life of its own, a modern-day morality play where he was the villain. Every article, every blog post rehashed the same damning details: the pregnancy, the affair, the insulting settlement offer. That detail, in particular, seemed to fascinate the public. The idea that he had tried to pay off a multi-billion-dollar heiress with a check that wouldn't even cover her jewelry budget. It made him look not just cruel, but comically out of his depth. He started drinking heavily, the expensive whiskey he once savored now a tool for oblivion. He'd sit in his empty, silent apartment. He'd sold the Victorian in the divorce, a transaction Isabella's lawyers had handled with ruthless efficiency, and stare at the picture of her that was now everywhere. It wasn't the soft, gentle Izzy he remembered. This woman was a stranger. Her eyes held a formidable intelligence and a strength he had never recognized. Had it always been there, hidden in plain sight? Or had he created this woman with his betrayal? One night in a drunken haze, he called her. He didn't know what he would say, but he felt a desperate, primal need to connect with her, the one person who had truly known him. The call went to voicemail. Her voice, calm and professional, instructed the caller to leave a message for Miss Valeriano Rossi. He hung up without speaking. His downfall was swift and methodical. It wasn't a loud, explosive crash, but a quiet, systematic dismantling. A major real estate developer he was courting for a new fund suddenly pulled out, citing a conflict of interest after the Seraphim Group's real estate division made them a better offer. A tech startup he had his eye on for an IPO was suddenly acquired in a private deal financed by a Valeriano-backed venture capital firm. He was being boxed in, outmaneuvered at every turn. It was brilliant, terrifying, and undeniably personal. This wasn't just Niccolo Valeriano flexing his muscle. Ethan could feel Isabella's hand in it. She knew his strategies, his ambitions, his pressure points. She had listened to his business calls for years, had read his reports, had been a silent audience to his grand plans. Now she was using that intimate knowledge against him with devastating precision. The final killing stroke came a month after the news broke. Hayes Capital was insolvent. Facing bankruptcy and a slew of lawsuits from furious investors, Ethan was forced to sell. The only viable offer came from a private equity group he'd never heard of, NSR Holdings. They bought the firm for pennies on the dollar, acquiring his entire portfolio, his client list, everything. He was left with nothing but a mountain of debt and public disgrace. 2 weeks later, he was sitting in a nondescript bar in the financial district, nursing a cheap beer, when a news report came on the television above the bar. A financial news anchor was reporting on a major acquisition. NSR Holdings, the mysterious firm that recently acquired the remnants of Hayes Capital, has been revealed to be a subsidiary of the Seraphim Group. In a statement today, Seraphim's new head of portfolio strategy, Isabella Valeriano Rossi, announced plans to restructure the acquired assets. Ethan stared at the screen, the beer turning to acid in his stomach. She had bought his company. She owned his legacy, his dream, everything he had built. She hadn't just defeated him, she had consumed him. The house of cards had fallen, and she was standing in the rubble, holding the one card that truly mattered, the Queen. The Vegas boardroom was a world away from the quiet, dust-mote-filled studios where Isabella had once painstakingly restored Renaissance paintings. Here the art was in the deal, the canvas was a balance sheet, and the colors were the black of profit and the red of loss. The air hummed with a different kind of energy, not the patient silence of creation, but the charged, kinetic thrill of immense wealth in motion. Isabella felt surprisingly at home. Her initial foray into the family business had been driven by a primal need for survival and a cold thirst for justice. But as the weeks turned into months, something else began to take root. She discovered she had an aptitude for it, a natural instinct for the intricate dance of power and finance. The same meticulous eye that could spot a forged brushstroke could now identify a flaw in a corporate strategy. The same patience that allowed her to spend weeks on a single piece of damaged canvas now enabled her to wait for the perfect moment to make a move in the market. She didn't try to emulate her grandfather's iron-fisted patriarchal style. Instead, she brought her own quiet, analytical approach to the table. She listened more than she spoke, absorbing information from Lena, the CFO, and Marco, the head of security, who became her trusted mentors. They in turn were impressed by her sharp mind and her lack of ego. She wasn't playing at being a boss, she was learning to be a leader. Her first major test came with the acquisition of Hayes Capital. It had been her idea, a move that was both strategically brilliant and deeply personal. While her grandfather would have been content to simply crush Ethan's firm, Isabella saw an opportunity. His portfolio is fundamentally sound, she had argued in the boardroom, her voice calm and steady, betraying none of the emotion swirling inside her. His mistake wasn't his investment strategy, it was his character. The assets are undervalued because of the panic surrounding his name. We can acquire them for a fraction of their worth, absorb them into our own private equity division, and turn a significant profit within 2 quarters. It was a cold, calculated move, and Niccolo had looked at her with a gleam of immense pride in his eyes. This was the Valeriano blood he knew. Now she was in the process of restructuring her former husband's company. She sifted through the files, the business plans, the very documents that represented Ethan's life's work. It was a surreal experience. She saw the ghost of the man she had loved in the margins of his notes, in the ambitious, sometimes reckless projections he had made. She saw his brilliance, but also his fatal flaw, a deep-seated insecurity that drove him to constantly seek external validation. One afternoon, Maya, Ethan's former assistant, whom Isabella had personally insisted on keeping, brought her a file. This was a side project Mr. Hayes was passionate about, Maya said, her loyalty now firmly transferred. A clean energy fund. He believed in it, but he could never get the more conservative investors like Mr. Thorne to back it. Isabella opened the file. The proposal was well-researched, innovative, and surprisingly forward-thinking. It was a glimpse of a better man, a man who could see beyond the next deal. It was the Ethan she had first fallen in love with. A pang of something, not love, but a sad, complex nostalgia, went through her. She made a note. This fund would be her first priority. She would make it successful, not for him, but because it was a sound investment, that it would also serve as a final, quiet testament to her superior judgment was a satisfying bonus. As her belly grew, so did her confidence. Her pregnancy, which Ethan had deemed a complication, became her armor. Walking through the casino floors, her hand resting on her stomach, she was a symbol of the future, of the continuation of the Valeriano dynasty. The staff, from the dealers to the security guards, looked at her with a fierce, protective loyalty. She was one of them. She was carrying the air. But her new life was not without its own challenges. The Valeriano world was filled with sharks who smelled blood in the water. Distant cousins and ambitious executives who had been circling her grandfather for years now saw her as an obstacle. A rival casino owner, a slick corporate raider named Sterling, made a public play to acquire one of their smaller hotel properties, a direct challenge to her new authority. Instead of meeting him with her grandfather's usual aggressive tactics, Isabella requested a face-to-face meeting. They met in a neutral location, a quiet lounge downtown. Sterling was all predatory smiles and condescending charm. "Miss Valeriano Rossi," he began, "I'm sure we can come to a mutually beneficial arrangement. A woman in your condition shouldn't be dealing with such stressful business." Isabella let the insult hang in the air before she responded, her voice soft but laced with steel. "Mr. Sterling, I've reviewed your company's financials. Your debt-to-equity ratio is concerning. You're over-leveraged. This play for our property isn't a power move. It's a desperate attempt to acquire a stable asset to reassure your creditors." Sterling's smile faltered. "So here is my counteroffer," Isabella continued, leaning forward slightly. "You will withdraw your bid publicly by the end of the day. In return, I will not share my analysis of your company's financial instability with the ratings agencies. My grandfather has a very persuasive way with them." She took a sip of her water. "And if you ever condescend to me or my condition again, I will buy your company out from under you and turn your flagship casino into a parking garage. Am I clear?" He stared at her, his face pale. He had come expecting to intimidate a novice and had found himself facing a queen. He nodded curtly, the bravado gone. By the end of the day, his bid was withdrawn. She had won, and she had done it her way. That evening, she stood on her balcony, the city lights a river of diamonds below. She felt the baby kick, a strong, reassuring flutter. She was building a new life, a new kind of empire, not just for herself, but for her child. The pain of Ethan's betrayal had not vanished, but it had been transformed. It was no longer a wound, but a crucible that had forged her into something stronger, something unbreakable. She had been a wife, an accessory, a victim. Now she was Isabella Valeriano, and she was sitting on a different kind of throne, one she was building for herself. The gilded cage was a distant memory. Before her lay a kingdom. The bottom was not a fiery, dramatic crash. It was a slow, grinding descent into a gray, anonymous existence. Ethan Hayes, the man whose name had once been a synonym for success in San Francisco's financial circles, was now just another face in the crowd. He'd lost everything: his company, his reputation, his home, his lover. All that remained was a crushing mountain of debt in the ghost of the man he used to be. He moved into a small, soulless apartment in a part of the city he once would have flown over without a second glance. The sleek, minimalist furniture of his old life was replaced by cheap, functional pieces from IKEA. The bespoke suits were traded for jeans and worn-out shirts. He sold his Aston Martin to cover a fraction of his legal fees and now took the bus, averting his eyes from the glint of luxury cars that passed him by. He was unemployable. His name was toxic. Every door he knocked on was politely but firmly shut in his face. The financial world, a world built on trust and reputation, had excommunicated him. The men who had once slapped him on the back and called him a genius now crossed the street to avoid him. Shame was his constant companion. It was there when he woke up in the morning to the sound of his neighbors' screaming kids, and it was there when he fell into a restless, alcohol-fueled sleep at night. He replayed his final conversation with Isabella over and over in his mind, each word a fresh torment. "A complication I can't afford." How could he have been so callous, so blind? He saw her face everywhere, on the cover of magazines in the supermarket checkout line, on financial news segments playing in the corner of a dingy bar. The media portrayed her as a brilliant, avenging angel, a corporate icon in the making. They lauded her business acumen, her quiet strength, her grace under pressure. They told the story of her victory, which was, by necessity, the story of his defeat. He watched obsessed as she transformed the company he had built. She had taken his passion project, the Clean Energy Fund, and poured resources into it, turning it into the most successful and lauded division of the new portfolio. It was a move so shrewd, so utterly galling, that he could almost admire it. She wasn't just erasing him, she was improving on him, proving that his best ideas could only flourish without him at the helm. The solitude gnawed at him. Chloe was long gone, her social media feed a curated gallery of yacht parties and exotic vacations with a new, more promising billionaire. His old friends had vanished. He was an outcast, a pariah. One day, driven by a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical illness, he went to a place he hadn't been in years, his parents' modest suburban home. They were simple, good people who had never understood his relentless ambition. They had been quietly proud of his success, but deeply unsettled by the man he had become in its pursuit. His mother opened the door, her face etched with a mixture of love and pain. She didn't say, "I told you so." She just hugged him, and for the first time in months, Ethan allowed himself to break. He wept in his mother's arms, the sobs of a broken man who had finally hit the bedrock of his own failure. He started attending therapy, forced by a court mandate related to one of the investor lawsuits. He went in cynical and defensive, but the therapist, a patient, no-nonsense woman, began to chip away at the armor of arrogance he had built around himself. "Why did you need to be so successful, Ethan?" she asked one session. "I wanted to build something," he answered, the old familiar justification, "to make a mark." "Or were you running from something?" she countered. "What were you so afraid of?" The question burrowed deep. He had spent his whole life running, from his humble origins, from the fear of being ordinary, from the quiet terror that, underneath all the ambition and the expensive suits, he was fundamentally not enough. Isabella, with her quiet self-possession and her mysterious, unexamined past, had been a comfort at first. But as his star rose, her stillness began to feel like an anchor. Her pregnancy had been the ultimate threat, a force of nature that would ground him, make him ordinary, tie him to a life of domesticity he equated with failure. He had pushed her away not because she was weak, but because he was terrified of the strength her love demanded of him. He got a job, not on Wall Street, but at a small, non-profit community lending organization that helped fund local businesses. The pay was a joke compared to what he once made in an hour, but for the first time in his life, his work felt meaningful. He was helping people build their dreams, a bakery, a bookstore, a bike shop. He was using his skills not to accumulate wealth, but to create value in his own community. He stopped drinking. He started running, pounding the pavement every morning, the physical exertion a way to exorcise the demons of his past. He was thinner. His face was lined with a new, hard-won humility. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet sobriety. 6 months after losing everything, he was walking home from work when he saw her. She was coming out of a bookstore, heavily pregnant and radiating a serene, powerful beauty. She was laughing at something her companion, an older, well-dressed man, who must have been her grandfather, had said. She looked happy, genuinely, incandescently happy. He ducked into a doorway, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw her, but she did not see him. And in that moment, the last vestiges of his anger and self-pity dissolved, replaced by a profound and aching sense of regret. He hadn't just lost a fortune. He had lost her. He had thrown away a love that was real for a dream that was hollow. And that was a debt he would spend the rest of his life trying to repay. Not to her, but to himself. The birth of her son, Marco Niccolo Valeriano, was the moment Isabella's world truly realigned. Holding the tiny, perfect infant in her arms, she felt a love so fierce and absolute, it eclipsed everything else. The last traces of her grief for Ethan, the lingering bitterness of his betrayal, finally dissolved. They were irrelevant noise in the face of this beautiful, profound new reality. Her son was not a complication. He was the reason for everything. She embraced her life in Las Vegas, not as a temporary refuge, but as her home. She proved to be a formidable and visionary leader for the Seraphim Group, blending her grandfather's old-school wisdom with her own modern, ethical approach. She expanded the company into new, sustainable ventures, reinvested in the local community, and created a corporate culture that valued loyalty and integrity. She was respected, admired, and, in some circles, feared. But she was no longer just the heiress. She was the architect of her own legacy. She rarely thought of Ethan. When she did, it was with a distant, clinical pity. He was a chapter of her life that was closed, a lesson learned. She had heard through the grapevine that he had lost everything and fallen off the map. She felt a flicker of satisfaction, but it was fleeting. His fate was no longer her concern. A year after Marco's birth, she was in San Francisco for a series of meetings. She had brought her son with her, unable to be away from him for more than a few hours. One afternoon, while her grandfather watched the baby in their hotel suite, she decided to take a walk, a nostalgic impulse leading her toward the park near her old neighborhood. As she sat on a bench watching the leaves fall, a man's voice, quiet and hesitant, spoke her name. Isabella? She looked up. It was Ethan. The change in him was so stark it took her a moment to recognize him. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by a simple jacket and worn jeans. The confident, predatory swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet, almost tentative posture. He was thinner, and his eyes, once so full of arrogant fire, now held a deep, sorrowful humility. He looked broken, but also for the first time real. Her first instinct was a surge of cold fury. The security guard, Leo, who was always discreetly nearby, took a step forward, his hand moving toward his jacket. Isabella gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head, and he stopped. "What do you want, Ethan?" she asked, her voice even and cold. "Nothing," he said quickly, holding up his hands as if to show he was unarmed. "I don't want anything. I saw you, and I had to say something." He took a shaky breath. "I'm sorry, Isabella, for everything. There are no words to describe how sorry I am." She looked at him, searching his face for any sign of the old manipulation, the calculated charm. She found none. All she saw was a man hollowed out by regret. "Sorry doesn't fix what you did," she said, her voice flat. "I know," he whispered, his eyes glistening. "I know it doesn't. I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I was a coward. I was a fool. I threw away the only real thing in my life because I was terrified. I built my entire world on a foundation of ego and fear, and I deserve to watch it all turn to dust." He gestured vaguely back in the direction of the financial district. "You know, for a long time I was angry. I thought you and your grandfather had destroyed me. And you did. You beat me at my own game. You were smarter and stronger and more ruthless than I ever was." A wry, self-deprecating smile touched his lips. "But you didn't destroy me. You saved me." Isabella stared at him, bewildered. "Saved you? By taking everything away, you forced me to look at the man who was left when the money and the power were gone. And I hated him," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm trying to be a better man now. A good man. The kind of man who would have been worthy of you. The kind of father our son deserved." He looked away toward a group of children playing on the swings. "I know I have no right to ask, but is he—" "He's beautiful," Isabella said, the words catching in her throat. "He's happy and healthy and so loved." She saw the flicker of pain and longing in his eyes, and for the first time she felt not anger, but a profound, aching sadness for him, for the life he had willingly forfeited. "I don't want to be in his life," Ethan said, as if reading her mind. "I lost that right. It would only confuse him. I want you to know that I will spend the rest of my life trying to be a man he could have been proud of, from a distance." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, clumsily wrapped package. "This is for him, for his first birthday. Please, you don't have to tell him it's from me." He placed it on the bench between them and took a step back. Isabella looked at the small gift, then back at him. She saw the truth of his words in his eyes. This wasn't a ploy. It wasn't a trick. It was an act of penance. She gave a single, slow nod. "Okay, Ethan." A look of immense, heartbreaking relief washed over his face. "Thank you," he whispered. He turned and walked away without another word, disappearing into the anonymous afternoon crowd. Isabella sat for a long time, the small gift resting beside her. She did not open it. She didn't need to. She knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul that the debt between them had finally been paid. Not with money, not with revenge, but with this: a quiet admission, a heartfelt apology, an act of silent, selfless love. He had lost his kingdom, but in doing so he had perhaps, finally, found his soul. And she, in defending her own, had built an empire far greater than the one she had inherited. She picked up the small gift and walked back toward her hotel, toward her son, toward the future. Isabella's story is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't just about the power you're born with, but the power you claim in the face of betrayal. From the depths of heartbreak, she didn't just survive. She built an empire and found a deeper purpose. Ethan's journey from a ruthless tycoon to a man seeking redemption shows that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find yourself. Their story is one of love, loss, and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. If you were moved by this story of transformation and justice, please hit the like button, share this video with someone who loves a dramatic tale, and subscribe to our channel for more emotional stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat.
What happens when a billionaire publicly humiliates his ex-wife at the most prestigious gala of the year? Richard Beaumont, a titan of industry, thought he had it all. Standing on a pedestal of wealth and arrogance, he pointed at his former wife, Catherine, and let out a booming laugh for all to hear, mocking her fall from grace. He thought she was a forgotten chapter, a nobody, but he made one critical mistake. He forgot who he was dealing with. In the next 60 seconds, the entire world would watch as the sound of rotor blades silenced the crowd, and all cameras turned towards the sky, capturing an arrival that would not just shatter Richard's ego, but threaten to bring his entire empire crumbling to the ground. The divorce wasn't a battle, it was a demolition. Richard Beaumont, with the full might of Beaumont Industries and the legal prowess of Sullivan and Cromwell Elp behind him, had systematically dismantled Catherine Davenport's life. In the sterile mahogany-paneled conference room high above Park Avenue, she hadn't stood a chance. Richard's lead counsel, a shark named Arthur Kendrick, had laid out the terms with a chillingly polite smile. The prenuptial agreement was ironclad, he'd explained, as if speaking to a child. Catherine would receive a one-time settlement, a sum that sounded vast to the average person, but was in Richard's world less than the depreciation on his private jet in a single year. She would forfeit any claim to their properties, their art collection, and most cruelly, any stake in the company she had quietly helped shape. "You were a decorator," Catherine Richard had said, his voice laced with a casual cruelty that was far more painful than outright rage. He adjusted his Brioni tie, a picture of unassailable power. "You picked out curtains and planned parties. Let's not pretend you were ever a partner in any meaningful sense." Catherine remembered gripping the arms of her chair, her knuckles white. She had wanted to scream. She had wanted to list every late night she'd spent combing through financial reports. He'd been too bored to read every strategic insight she'd offered over dinner that he'd later presented as his own in the boardroom. Every social event she had masterfully orchestrated to woo a difficult investor or smooth over one of his public gaffes. She had been his silent strategist, his social architect, his emotional ballast. He had seen her as furniture. The final decree felt like a final nail. The press, fed a steady diet of curated leaks from Richard's PR team, painted a predictable picture. The beautiful but vapid socialite attempting to fleece her brilliant, long-suffering husband. The headlines in the New York Post were brutal. Catherine stopped leaving her apartment, the palatial Fifth Avenue penthouse that was no longer hers. The silence in the vast space was deafening, broken only by the hum of the climate control and the distant symphony of city traffic. Her last day in the penthouse was a study in humiliation. Richard had sent his new girlfriend, a lingerie model named Lauren, to supervise Catherine's packing. Lauren, all of 24 and radiating an effortless condescension, trailed her through the rooms, pointing at items with a manicured finger. "Richard said you could take the Wedgwood plates," Lauren chirped, examining her reflection in a gilded mirror. "The ones from his grandmother. It's a very generous gesture." Catherine looked at the plates, each one a memory of a tense family holiday she had navigated with painstaking diplomacy. They felt tainted. She packed only her clothes, her books, and a small, unassuming painting of a windswept coastline she had bought with her own money years before she'd met Richard. As she walked out of the service elevator for the last time, the doorman, a kind man named Patrick, who had always shared a friendly word, avoided her gaze. In Richard Beaumont's world, irrelevance was a communicable disease. She moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment in Greenwich Village, paid for with the first installment of her settlement. The change was jarring. The grandeur of Fifth Avenue was replaced by the rumble of the subway and the chatter of students from nearby NYU. For the first month, she did almost nothing. She existed in a grey fog of shock and grief, not just for her marriage, but for the years she had invested in a man who had valued her at nothing. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday. She was trying to make sense of her finances, the settlement that was meant to last a lifetime, but felt terrifyingly finite. She spread the papers across her small dining table the same way she used to do with Richard's business files, and then she saw it. A footnote in a prospectus for a venture capital fund she'd once researched for him. It mentioned a burgeoning field, predictive data analytics for renewable energy grids. It was a sector deemed too niche, too volatile by major players like Beaumont Industries, who were still heavily invested in traditional energy. Richard had scoffed at it. Green energy is a charity project, Catherine, not a business. But looking at the data, the projected growth, the increasing government subsidies, Catherine saw something else. She saw a blind spot. Richard's blind spot. He was a titan, yes, but a titan from a dying era, too arrogant to see the shift coming. A tiny spark ignited within the fog. It was an idea fragile, but persistent. She spent the next week devouring everything she could find on the topic. She called professors, read white papers, and built financial models on a cheap laptop. The woman Richard had dismissed as a decorator was in secret a formidable researcher with an intuitive grasp of market dynamics. She had one last card to play, one connection Richard had never bothered to cultivate. Henry Wallace, a legendary semi-retired venture capitalist. Henry had been a friend of her father's. Richard had always found him dull, a relic from a bygone era of handshake deals and long-term vision. He had dismissed him as past his prime. Catherine knew better. Henry Wallace didn't invest in companies. He invested in people. With trembling hands, she picked up her phone. She had no company, no staff, and a business plan sketched out on legal pads. But she had an idea, and for the first time in a very long time, she had a flicker of hope. She was no longer Mrs. Beaumont. She was Catherine Davenport, and she was about to start building. The first meeting with Henry Wallace took place in a dusty book-lined office in a pre-war building overlooking Gramercy Park. The contrast with Richard's sleek, minimalist corporate headquarters was stark. Henry's office was a place of substance, not style. It smelled of old paper leather and pipe tobacco. Henry, a man in his late 70s, with eyes that had lost none of their sharpness, listened without interruption for nearly 2 hours. He leaned back in his worn leather chair, fingertips steepled as Catherine laid out her vision. She wasn't just talking about solar panels or wind turbines. She was talking about the brain behind them. She spoke of AI-driven software that could predict energy consumption spikes, reroute power from surplus grids to deficit areas in real time, and optimize battery storage to eliminate waste. She called her nascent company Nexus Solutions. Beaumont Industries and others like it, they see energy as a commodity to be extracted and sold. Catherine explained, her voice gaining confidence with every word. They are playing checkers. I want to play chess. The future isn't in generating power, it's in managing it intelligently. That's where the real value, the real revolution lies. She handed him a meticulously prepared folder containing market analysis, 5-year projections, and a lean, scalable business model. He took his time, turning each page slowly, his expression unreadable. Finally, he closed the folder and looked at her, a long, appraising stare. Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. Richard is a fool, Henry said, his voice a low rumble. He always was. He inherited an empire and thinks he built it. He can't tell the difference between a balance sheet and a vision. He tapped the folder. This is a vision. He opened a drawer in his heavy oak desk and took out a checkbook. I'll provide the seed funding, not as a loan, but for a 20% stake. I'm not a banker, Catherine. I'm a partner. Tears pricked Catherine's eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. This was not a moment for weakness. It was a moment of validation. Thank you, Henry. She managed, her voice thick with emotion. "Don't thank me," he grunted, scribbling on the check. "Make me money, and more importantly, prove that arrogant son of a bitch wrong." The next 2 years were a blur of relentless work. Catherine moved out of her Greenwich Village apartment and into a smaller, cheaper one in Astoria, Queens, pouring every cent of her settlement and Henry's investment into Nexus Solutions. Her first office was a shared workspace above a bakery where the smell of yeast and sugar mingled with the electric hum of servers. She hired a small, brilliant team of young engineers and data scientists, convincing them to take a chance on her vision, with a combination of passion and stock options. She was the first one in every morning and the last one out, often sleeping on a couch in the office. She learned to code, she negotiated with hardware suppliers, and she pitched to early adopter clients, municipal governments, and environmentally conscious corporations that Richard's company had long ignored. She was no longer the woman who planned parties. She was a CEO running on caffeine and conviction. Her big break came when she secured a pilot program with the city of Portland, Oregon. Nexus Solutions software was implemented across a section of their grid, and the results were staggering. Within 6 months, they had reduced energy waste by 18% and prevented 3 major blackouts during a summer heatwave. The case study went viral within the industry. Suddenly, Catherine Davenport was no longer a ghost. She was a name whispered in tech circles. Nexus Solutions began attracting attention and, more importantly, clients. A second round of funding, led by a prestigious Silicon Valley firm, valued her company at a figure that made her initial settlement from Richard look like pocket change. She moved Nexus Solutions into a proper office in the Flatiron district, a space filled with light plants and the vibrant energy of a company on the rise. She still worked punishing hours, but now there was a sense of momentum, of inevitability. She allowed herself small luxuries, like buying a new suit from the Row, not because it was a status symbol, but because it felt like armor. She rarely thought of Richard, except as a distant data point, a symbol of the old guard she was working to supplant. She never read the society pages anymore and had no idea what he was up to. Her world was no longer defined by his. It was defined by gigawatts data streams and the quiet satisfaction of building something real, something that mattered. She was no longer just surviving. She was thriving completely off the radar of the world she had once inhabited. And that was exactly how she liked it. While Catherine was building her empire, in the light, Richard Beaumont was struggling to keep his from crumbling in the shadows. On the surface, nothing had changed. He was still a fixture at all the right restaurants, his pronouncements on the market were still quoted by Bloomberg, and Lauren was still a decorative accessory on his arm. But inside the glass and steel fortress of Beaumont Industries, the foundations were cracking. The source of the rot was a disastrous acquisition made 3 years prior. Richard, driven by ego, had overpaid for a legacy oil company in Texas, convinced he could squeeze out efficiencies and ride one last wave of fossil fuel profits. He had ignored the warnings of his own analysts, who pointed to shifting political winds and the unstoppable rise of renewables. The deal was a dud. The oil fields were less productive than promised, and new environmental regulations had turned the asset into a billion-dollar liability. Beaumont Industries was bleeding cash. The stock, once a blue-chip stalwart, was stagnating. The board was growing restless. Richard, for the first time in his life, felt the cold prickle of fear. He projected an aura of unshakable confidence, but his nights were sleepless, filled with the gnawing anxiety of failure. His lifeline, his one big play to reverse the tide, was Oratech. It was a small, privately held robotics and AI logistics company based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Oratech wasn't glamorous, but their proprietary software was revolutionary. It could automate entire supply chains from warehouse to delivery with terrifying efficiency. For Beaumont Industries, which spent a fortune on logistics for its myriad divisions, acquiring Oratech would slash costs by billions instantly, boosting their bottom line and dazzling Wall Street. It would be the masterstroke that secured his legacy. He'd been in aggressive private negotiations to buy the company for months. The founder, an eccentric MIT professor, was notoriously difficult, but Richard was confident his money could solve any problem. He saw it as a done deal. One afternoon, Henry Wallace called Catherine. His voice was calm, but she could detect an underlying urgency. "I'm hearing things, Catherine," he said. "Richard Beaumont is in trouble, deeper than anyone knows. He staked his entire reputation on acquiring a company called Auratech." Catherine felt a jolt. Auratech, the AI logistics firm? The very one. Their automation software is the best in the world. I know you've been looking at ways to streamline the hardware deployment side of Nexus. You should take a look at them. I have, Catherine admitted. We did a deep dive a few months ago. Their tech is brilliant. It could cut our installation and maintenance overhead by 40%. But they weren't for sale. The founder is particular. "Everyone has a price," Henry said, "and desperate men like Richard tend to make a lot of noise. He's been trying to bully them into a sale. It's not working. The founder doesn't like him. Perhaps he'd prefer a different kind of buyer, someone with a vision for the future, not someone trying to patch up the past." The implication hung in the air. This wasn't just about synergy or business strategy anymore. This was a crossroads. Auratech was the key to Richard's survival. It was also the key to catapulting Nexus Solutions into the next stratosphere. The two paths, which had diverged so completely, were about to collide. Catherine spent the next week in a whirlwind of secret activity. She flew to Boston on a private charter, a necessity she now saw as a business tool, not an indulgence. She didn't meet the Auratech founder in a boardroom. Instead, respecting his known eccentricities, she met him at the MIT Museum, surrounded by the history of innovation. His name was Dr. Heiress, a man with a wild mane of white hair and a mind that moved at the speed of light. He had been stonewalling Richard for months, disgusted by his corporate raiding tactics. Catherine didn't talk about share prices or cost-cutting. She talked about the future. She showed him how his logistics AI could be integrated with her energy management AI to create truly smart, sustainable cities. She painted a picture of a world where his technology wasn't just making a dinosaur of a company more efficient, but was actively building a better, cleaner world. "Mr. Beaumont wants to use my life's work to make his shipping manifests cheaper," Dr. Thorne said, his eyes twinkling. "You want to use it to build the future." He didn't agree on the spot, but when Catherine flew back to New York, she knew she had planted a seed in fertile ground. Over the next few days, her lawyers, working in concert with Henry's team, drafted an offer. It was audacious, structured, with a mix of cash and a significant stake in the combined future entity of Nexus Aura. It was a partnership, not a conquest. The offer was sent. For 72 hours, there was silence. Catherine felt a tension she hadn't experienced since the early days of Nexus. On the third day, as she was reviewing schematics for a new project, an encrypted email arrived. It was from Dr. Thorne's legal team. They had accepted her offer. The deal was done. Nexus Solutions, the company, born from the ashes of her divorce, had just acquired the one asset Richard Beaumont needed to save himself. And no one, least of all Richard, knew a thing. The contracts were signed under a strict non-disclosure agreement, with the official announcement to be made in 1 week's time at the annual Metropolitan Innovators Gala, where the keynote speaker was, until now, a closely guarded secret. The Metropolitan Innovators Gala was the glittering apex of the New York business and tech calendar. It was a night of self-congratulation, of hushed deals made over champagne, and of a carefully calibrated social hierarchy on full display. Richard Beaumont was in his element. He stood near the center of the vast starlit ballroom at the Museum of Modern Art, a glass of vintage Dom Perignon in his hand, Lauren clinging to his arm like a designer handbag. He was holding court, his voice booming over the polite murmur of the crowd. He felt invincible tonight. The final papers for the Auratech acquisition were, he believed, being drawn up. His lawyers had assured him the reclusive founder was just playing hard to get, that their latest overwhelming cash offer would be irresistible. Tonight was a victory lap. He was Richard Beaumont, and he always won. Then across the room he saw her, Catherine. He hadn't seen her in person in almost 3 years. She looked different. The expensive, sometimes frivolous fashion of her past life was gone, replaced by a simple, exquisitely cut black gown by Narciso Rodriguez. It was severe, elegant, and utterly commanding. She wasn't dripping in diamonds. Her only jewelry was a pair of subtle platinum earrings. She looked formidable. A flicker of something unpleasant, an emotion he couldn't name, went through him. She was speaking with Henry Wallace, the old relic. Richard scoffed internally. Of course. The washed-up investor and the washed-up wife. A perfect pair. His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp British accent. Mr. Beaumont, Olivia Monroe, Financial Times. And Richard turned, his public smile snapping into place. Olivia Monroe was a piranha, a reporter, known for her incisive, often brutal, business reporting. Ms. Monroe, he said smoothly, enjoying the party? Immensely, she replied, her eyes sharp. I was hoping for a comment on the rumors swirling around Beaumont Industries, the whispers of a liquidity crisis, and your rather aggressive, some might say, desperate pursuit of Auratech. Richard's smile tightened. The directness of the question in this public forum was a clear attack. He could feel the ears of those around him perking up. He needed to deflect, to reassert his dominance. And then his eyes fell on Catherine again. She was the perfect scapegoat, an easy target to re-establish his own superiority. He let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a performance, and he threw his head back to make sure everyone saw it. Desperate! He boomed, his voice dripping with condescension. He deliberately raised his arm and pointed directly at Catherine across the room. 100 heads turned to follow his gesture. You're asking me about desperation. Catherine, who had been deep in conversation, looked up, her expression turning from confusion to disbelief as she saw she was the center of a sudden, unwelcome spotlight. Richard's voice carried across the ballroom. If you want to know about financial trouble, you should be asking her for advice. Last I heard, she was decorating shoebox apartments in Queens. Maybe she can give you tips on how to stretch a budget. A wave of uncomfortable laughter and shocked murmurs rippled through this elite crowd. It was a stunningly cruel public humiliation. Lauren giggled beside him, squeezing his arm. Richard felt a surge of triumph. He had turned the tables, belittled the reporter, and put his ex-wife in her place all in one stroke. He was the king of this jungle. Catherine stood frozen for a moment, the blood draining from her face. The stares of hundreds of people felt like physical blows. She could see the pity, the morbid curiosity, the faint smirks. She saw Richard, puffed up with arrogance, soaking in his petty victory. For a split second, the old, powerless Catherine threatened to surface. But then something else took over. A cold, quiet calm. She simply held his gaze from across the room, her expression unreadable. She didn't need to say a word. She just had to wait. It was at that exact moment that a new sound began to permeate the ballroom. It started as a low, rhythmic thumping, barely perceptible over the string quartet. But it grew steadily louder, a deep, percussive hump, hump, whump that vibrated through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking the museum's sculpture garden. The conversations faltered. Heads turned from Catherine, tilting upwards towards the source of the sound. It was the unmistakable sound of a helicopter not passing over, but descending and descending fast, somewhere very close by. All eyes, including a bewildered Richard's, swiveled to the windows. The flashing navigation lights of a sleek black Sikorsky S-76 sliced through the night sky as it prepared to land on the helipad of the skyscraper adjacent to the museum. The string quartet, trailed off into an awkward silence, completely drowned out. The entire gala, the titans of finance, the tech gurus, the society mavens, was now captivated by this unscheduled arrival. The cameras of the press, which had just been trained on Richard's mocking face, now turned as one pointing their long lenses towards the drama unfolding outside. Richard stared confused. "What the hell is that?" he muttered. On the stage at the far end of the ballroom, the night's master of ceremonies, a well-known news anchor, hurried to the podium, a frantic-looking assistant, whispering in his ear. He tapped the microphone, his professional composure visibly rattled. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice straining to be heard over the now idling rotor wash. We have a slight change to our program. It appears our keynote speaker, the anonymous benefactor of tonight's gala, has just arrived." A wave of excited murmurs swept the room. The identity of the benefactor had been the biggest mystery of the night. Richard felt a pang of annoyance. Who had the gall to upstage his moment? Then the MC continued, his voice filled with a newfound awe. "It is my profound honor to be the first to publicly announce two monumental pieces of news. First, the acquisition of Auratech has just been finalized. And second, please join me in welcoming the architect of that deal, the visionary founder and CEO of Nexus Solutions, Ms. Catherine Davenport." A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. Time seemed to slow down. Richard Beaumont's smug, triumphant expression collapsed as if it were a building imploding in on itself. His face cycled through a rapid series of emotions: confusion, denial, dawning comprehension, and finally a mask of ashen horror. The Dom Perignon glass slipped from his numb fingers and shattered on the polished floor, the sound lost in the stunned silence. Lauren looked from Richard's pale face to the stage, her mouth agape. "Catherine, you're Catherine," she whispered, the pieces not quite fitting together in her mind. All eyes which had been on the helicopter now snapped back to the woman in the simple black dress. Catherine Davenport, the woman Richard had just publicly ridiculed as a failure, was the mystery benefactor, the keynote speaker, the new owner of the very company he had staked his future on. It was a plot twist so audacious, so theatrical, it felt ripped from a Hollywood script. As if on cue, a side door near the stage opened. Catherine, who had slipped out of the main room unnoticed during the commotion, reappeared. She had not arrived in the helicopter. That was pure stagecraft, a power move orchestrated by Henry to perfection. She had been there all along, waiting. She walked towards the stage with a steady, unhurried grace, her heels clicking with quiet authority on the marble floor. The sea of billionaires and power brokers parted for her as if she were royalty. The camera flashes were blinding, a strobing, frantic volley of light that followed her every step. The reporters, led by a voraciously scribbling Olivia Monroe, scrambled for a better position. This wasn't just a business story anymore. It was the stuff of legend. Catherine ascended the small set of stairs to the stage. She shook the MC's hand and gave a small, polite nod to the stunned audience. She adjusted the microphone, her movements calm and deliberate. She looked out at the sea of faces, her gaze sweeping over them, before landing just for a moment on Richard. He looked small, shrunken. A man drowning in the wreckage of his own arrogance. She offered no smirk, no sign of triumph. Her expression was one of serene, implacable pshul. "Good evening," she began, her voice clear and steady, amplified throughout the cavernous space. "I apologize for the dramatic entrance. My partner, Henry Wallace, has a flair for the theatrical." A small, knowing laugh rippled through the audience as they glanced at the beaming Henry. "Some of you may remember me from a different life," she continued, her tone even. "A life of galas, much like this one, though my role was somewhat different then. But I'm not here tonight to talk about the past. I am here to talk about the future." She didn't mention Richard. She didn't need to. Every single person in that room was filling in the blanks. Her speech was a masterclass in substance over spectacle, though the spectacle of her presence was overwhelming. She spoke with passion and precision about the synergy between Nexus Solutions and Auratech. She laid out a vision for an integrated future of smart grids powered by sustainable energy and managed by an intelligent logistics network that eliminated waste at every level. For too long, she said, her voice ringing with conviction, the titans of industry have focused on extraction, extracting resources from the earth and extracting value for shareholders. They have operated from a mindset of scarcity and zero-sum games. But the future is not about extraction. It's about creation. It's about integration. It's about building systems that are not just profitable, but sustainable and intelligent. That is the mission of the new combined entity of Nexus and Aura. Richard stood paralyzed, the shattered glass at his feet, a perfect metaphor for his world. Every word Catherine spoke was a nail in his coffin. She hadn't just bought the company he needed. She had articulated a vision for the future that made him and his entire business model sound like a fossil. He was the past. She was undeniably the future. The board members of Beaumont Industries who were present in the room were studiously avoiding his gaze, their faces grim. They were already calculating the fallout. When Catherine finished her speech, the room, after a beat of stunned silence, erupted in thunderous applause. It was genuine, effusive, and long. It was the sound of a new queen being crowned. She gave a final, gracious nod and walked off the stage, not back towards the crowd, but towards the side exit, where Henry was waiting for her. Her work here was done. As she passed, she was intercepted by Olivia Munro, the reporter's eyes shining with professional zeal. Ms. Davenport, an incredible coup. Do you have any comment for Mr. Beaumont, who so publicly mocked you just moments before your announcement? Catherine paused. She looked past the reporter, her gaze sweeping over the chaotic room until it found Richard one last time. He looked utterly broken. She then turned back to Olivia, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. No comment, she said, her voice soft but firm. Mr. Beaumont has made his position quite clear, and tonight I've made mine. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving the world to digest the story of the woman who had been laughed out of the room only to return and buy the building. The dawn that broke over New York City was mercilessly clear. For Richard Beaumont, it illuminated the wreckage of his life with crystalline precision. He woke on a silk sofa in his cavernous living room, the memory of the gala a toxic sludge in his mind. The penthouse was silent. Lauren was gone. On the marble kitchen island, a single sheet of her personalized stationery was left next to her discarded engagement ring. The note was short and brutal. I can't be associated with this. Don't call me. He stumbled towards his phone, dreading what he would find. The screen flared to life with a digital scream, 312 missed calls, over 1,000 notifications. At the top of the feed was Olivia Munro's article for the Financial Times. The headline, already syndicated across the globe, was a dagger, the gala, the helicopter, and the humiliation. How Catherine Davenport redefined corporate revenge. Below it, a split-screen photo on the left. Richard, his face a mask of arrogant mockery as he pointed across the room. On the right, Catherine on the stage, poised and powerful. He looked like a bully, a fool. She looked like a queen. His thumb trembled as he opened his stock app. In pre-market trading, Beaumont Industries, BEA, was in a catastrophic vertical dive, down 42%. Billions in market capitalization had evaporated overnight, based on a single moment of public hubris. His legacy, his family's name, was being immolated on the pyre of his ego. Then the phone rang. It was Robert Caldwell, the lead independent director of his board, a man Richard had played golf with for 20 years. Robert, Richard began, his voice a dry croak. It was a spectacle, I know, but we can manage the narrative. There is no narrative to manage, Richard. Robert's voice was like ice water. There was no familiarity, no friendship, only the cold calculus of corporate survival. The board convened an emergency teleconference an hour ago. We have lost all faith in your leadership. Your actions were not just embarrassing, they were a catastrophic breach of fiduciary duty. You publicly attacked the very individual who held the key to our company's future, a fact you were clearly unaware of. It demonstrates a level of recklessness that is indefensible. Robert, you can't. This is not a discussion. It's a notification. Caldwell cut him off coldly. There will be a formal meeting at 4 p.m. We expect your resignation. If you refuse, the board is unanimous in its decision to terminate for cause. Your security credentials for the building have already been revoked. A courier will deliver the relevant documents this morning. The line went dead. He was locked out, a prisoner in his own penthouse. He stared at the phone in his hand, this sleek, black obelisk that connected him to the world, and felt an overwhelming urge to destroy it. With a roar of pure, impotent rage, he hurled it against a wall of Italian marble, where it shattered into 1,000 useless pieces. The silence that returned was absolute, the silence of a tomb. Across the city, in an apartment overlooking the Flatiron district, Catherine Davenport's morning was the mirror opposite. She had been awake since 5, not reveling in victory, but immersed in the complex schematics of Oratech's server architecture. Her world hadn't stopped for celebration. It had accelerated. Her own phone was buzzing incessantly, but for entirely different reasons. Her investors from Silicon Valley called their voices giddy with excitement. The board of Nexus Solutions called, offering effusive congratulations. Her company's stock, on the cusp of its own public offering, was now one of the most anticipated IPOs in a decade. Her response to each caller was the same gracious calm and relentlessly forward-looking. "Thank you, Mark, I appreciate it," she said to a prominent venture capitalist. "But the real work starts now. I'm looking at the integration plan for the Cambridge team. I'd like to schedule a call to discuss revised Q3 projections." Her assistant, a sharp young woman named Sarah, stood in the doorway of her home office, looking overwhelmed. "The media requests are insane," Sarah said. "Every major network wants an exclusive. Time wants to put you on the cover. Olivia Munro has called 5 times. Catherine looked up from her screen, her expression thoughtful. "Decline them all for now, Sarah. Please issue a single statement. Say that my priority is the well-being and integration of the employees of both Nexus Solutions and Oratech. This isn't about me. It's about the powerful future we are all going to build together." Her focus was a shield. By refusing to engage with the personal drama, she elevated the entire narrative. This wasn't a soap opera. It was a paradigm shift, and she was its architect. Later that morning, Henry Wallace found her, not in her executive suite, but in a glass-walled conference room, a whiteboard marker in her hand, deep in a technical debate with her 2 lead engineers. The office around them was buzzing with a joyful electric energy. Henry waited patiently, holding 2 cups of coffee. When she finally took a break, he handed one to her, along with a copy of the Wall Street Journal. The story was above the fold. "They're calling you the Quiet Titan," he said, his eyes twinkling. "A much better moniker than the one in the Post. They're calling you the Matriarch of Vengeance." Catherine glanced at the headline and frowned. "Vengeance is a fire that consumes the person who wields it, Henry. It's an emotional indulgence. This was never that. It was a strategic acquisition of a critical asset that an opponent foolishly undervalued and publicly insulted. The personal history simply provided the context." "The world doesn't see it that way." Henry smiled. "My phone has been ringing off the hook. A dozen of Richard's old rivals want to send you cases of champagne to celebrate his demise. Tell them to send their donations to the MIT Scholarship Fund instead," she said without hesitation. "We don't celebrate another's ruin, Henry. We celebrate our own success." There is a fundamental difference. She walked to the window looking out over the city. She could see the top of the Beaumont Industries Tower in the distance, a monument to a fading era. She felt no thrill, no surge of victorious adrenaline. She felt a quiet finality. Richard's greatest mistake, she realized, was not just his arrogance, but his inability to see beyond the personal. To him, business was a conquest, a war of egos. For her, it had become an act of creation. There are two balance sheets in life, she said, her voice soft but firm. The one you show your investors with profits and losses written in black and red ink. And then there's the unwritten one, the one that measures value and worth. Richard's unwritten balance sheet was now catastrophically in the red, his assets of pride and power revealed as toxic liabilities. Her own, she knew, was just beginning to show its true value. And it had nothing to do with Richard Beaumont's failure, and everything to do with her own hard-won success. Her victory wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of hers. 3 months after the Metropolitan Innovators Gala, the name Catherine Davenport had become synonymous with a new kind of power. She was on the cover of Forbes magazine, not in a gown, but in a hard hat at a Nexus Aura construction site. The headline, bold and unequivocal, "The Disruptor." How Catherine Davenport built a clean energy empire and rewrote the rules. The story of the gala had become a modern business legend, a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms about the dangers of hubris. For Catherine, however, the legend was a distraction. The real work was in the day-to-day grind of merging two distinct corporate cultures. Auratech's Cambridge-based academics and Nexus Solutions' scrappy New York engineers were a potent but volatile mix. Her days were a marathon of integration meetings, logistical analyses, and strategic planning sessions. She thrived on it. The complexities of building the company left little room for dwelling on the past. Richard Beaumont had been relegated to a closed file, a historical data point in her own stunning rise. The company Richard had left behind, Beaumont Industries, was in its death throes. Picked apart by activist investors and crushed by debt, it was being sold for scrap. Divisions were being shuttered or auctioned off to the highest bidder. It was a predictable end, and Catherine paid it little mind. Then the message came. It wasn't an email or a call, but a formal letter delivered by courier, written on the letterhead of a law firm she didn't recognize. It was from the trustee, managing the liquidation of Richard Beaumont's personal assets. The letter was circumspect, stating that Mr. Beaumont requested a brief private meeting to discuss a matter of profound personal and ethical importance. She tossed the letter onto her desk, annoyed at the intrusion. Her first instinct was to ignore it. What could they possibly have to discuss? That evening, she mentioned it to Henry during their weekly dinner. "He wants a meeting," she said, swirling the wine in her glass. Henry Wallace put down his fork, his expression hardening. "Don't do it, Catherine. There is absolutely nothing to be gained. You won. The story is over. Let him fade away. Any meeting will be a trap, a plea for money, a pathetic attempt at absolution, or worse, an effort to drag you back into his toxic orbit." "I know," Catherine said, staring into the candle's flame. "Logically, you're right. So you're going to ignore it." She was silent for a long moment. "I don't think I can," she admitted more to herself than to him. "It feels unfinished. Not for him, for me. I need to close the file myself, not just let it gather dust." Henry sighed, recognizing the same quiet determination that had convinced him to fund her impossible idea years ago. "If you must," he conceded, "then you control everything. The time, the place, the terms. No audience, no witnesses. And you walk away the second it serves no purpose." Catherine chose the Blue Bar at the Algonquin Hotel for the meeting. It was a place steeped in history, but quiet and discreet on a weekday afternoon. It was neutral ground belonging to neither her world nor the one she had shared with Richard. She arrived first, choosing a small secluded table in a dark corner. She ordered a sparkling water and waited, feeling a strange calm, the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a final, predictable chemical reaction. He was 10 minutes late. When he walked in, she almost didn't recognize him. The Richard Beaumont who approached her table was a ghost of the man who had pointed at her and laughed. The bespoke suits and confident swagger were gone. He wore a simple, slightly ill-fitting blazer and slacks. His face was gaunt, the skin sallow, and his eyes, once alight with arrogance, were hollowed out and haunted. He looked 20 years older. The Titan had become a spectre. "Catherine," he said, his voice raspy, unfamiliar. He gestured awkwardly to the chair opposite her. "Thank you for coming." She simply nodded, her expression unreadable. "You said this was a matter of importance." A waiter approached, and Richard flinched, almost startled by the attention. He ordered a coffee, his hands trembling slightly as he placed them on the table. "I'm not here to ask for anything for myself," he began, his gaze fixed on the tabletop. "I know what I did, what I said, the cruelty of it. I see it now. I was a fool blinded by pride. I deserve everything that's happened to me." And Catherine remained silent, offering no comfort, no absolution. This was his confession, not a negotiation. "But it's not about me," he continued finally, looking up. His eyes were filled with a raw, desperate plea she had never seen before. "It's about the company. Not my company anymore, I know that. But the original Beaumont Industrial Works. The one my grandfather started in a garage in Pittsburgh. It's about the people." He explained that while the oil and gas divisions were being sold off to competitors, one part of the company was about to be obliterated entirely, the Advanced Materials and Renewables Division. It was a small, underfunded R&D unit that his own father had started a passion project that Richard had always dismissed as a waste of resources. They had been working on next-generation battery technology and lightweight composite materials for wind turbines. "The liquidators are just going to shut it down," he said, his voice cracking. "Fire everyone. Sell the patents for pennies on the dollar to some overseas conglomerate. There are 250 employees in that division, Catherine. Brilliant scientists, engineers. People who have been with the company for decades. Their work is important. It was the one part of the company that was actually trying to build something for the future, and I ignored it." Catherine felt a sudden, sharp jolt of interest that cut through her detachment. She knew of the division. Her own team had tried to recruit some of their talent, but the engineers were famously loyal to the Beaumont legacy, if not to Richard himself. "I'm asking you to look at it," he pleaded, leaning forward. "Nexus Aura is the only company that would understand what they're doing. You could buy it, not as a favor to me. God, no. But because it's valuable. Because their work complements yours. You could save it, save their research, save their jobs. Let my family's name mean something more than just my failure." Here it was, the ultimate irony. The man who had defined her as a mere decorator was now begging her to recognize the value in a part of his own empire that he himself had been too blind to see. He wasn't asking for a handout. He was presenting her with a business opportunity, the last and only valuable card he had left to play. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time she didn't see the monster who had tried to destroy her. She saw a broken man trying to salvage a single piece of honor from the wreckage of his life. "I will have my team conduct their due diligence," she said, her voice cool and professional. "If the assets are viable and the price is fair, we will consider making an offer to the trustees." Relief washed over Richard's face so profoundly that he seemed to deflate. Tears welled in his eyes, and he quickly looked away, embarrassed. "Thank you," he whispered. "That's all I can ask." He stood to leave, a man with nothing left to say. As he turned, he paused. "For what it's worth, Catherine," he said, not looking at her. "I'm sorry. For everything." He walked away without waiting for a response, disappearing into the city's afternoon crowds. Catherine sat for a long time, the ice in her water melting completely. Henry had been wrong. The meeting had not been a trap. It had been something far more complex, a reckoning. The due diligence was swift and aggressive. Catherine's team discovered that the Beaumont Renewables division was, as Richard had claimed, a hidden gem. Their battery chemistry patents were potentially revolutionary, years ahead of the market. Richard, in his obsession with fossil fuels, had been sitting on a gold mine and hadn't even known it. 2 weeks later, the board of Nexus Aura unanimously approved the acquisition. The press release was simple and strategic, highlighting the synergy and the value of the patents. It mentioned in passing that the move would save over 200 jobs in Pittsburgh. There was no mention of Richard Beaumont. On the day the deal closed, Catherine was working late. The city lights twinkled outside her panoramic window. Her office was quiet, the hum of the servers, a comforting reminder of the machine she had built. Her gaze fell upon the painting of the windswept coastline, the one she had bought in a life before Richard, a symbol of a freedom she had once known and had now reclaimed on a scale she could never have imagined. She thought of Richard's apology. She felt no need to accept it or reject it. It was his burden, not hers. Her actions acquiring the division, saving the jobs, harnessing the technology, were not about him. They were not about forgiveness or revenge. They were the logical, strategic, and ultimately the right moves for her company, for the future she was building. She had won the war at the gala. But in the quiet of this hotel bar and the sterile language of an acquisition agreement, she had won the peace. She had proven that true power wasn't the ability to crush your enemies. It was the ability to build an empire so strong, so visionary, and so fundamentally sound that it could absorb the best parts of your enemy's legacy and make them your own, all while leaving the broken man behind. Her balance sheet wasn't just profitable, it was for the first time whole. And so Catherine Davenport's ascent was complete, not with a bitter laugh, but with the quiet hum of a well-earned empire. This wasn't just a story of revenge. It was a powerful testament to resilience, intelligence, and the incredible strength of a person who refuses to be defined by how others see them. Richard Beaumont didn't lose because he was outplayed in business. He lost because he fundamentally misunderstood the value of the person he threw away. Catherine's story reminds us that the ultimate power lies not in tearing someone else down, but in building yourself up far beyond their reach. What did you think of Catherine's epic comeback? Do you believe Richard got what he deserved? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were moved by this incredible story of triumph, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs a dose of inspiration, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life dramas that will leave you breathless.